Powered by Sports Interaction, Canada Sportsbook.
Hello and welcome to Game Over Montreal. Another Montreal Canadiens loss. It's been a tough March for the Montreal Canadiens, but as Team Tank knows, that's a good thing for this team long term. Moving down the standings is actually positive right now. So hey, good vibes only in the chat tonight. We got lots to talk about. I think it's going to be fun to talk about a few different things that I've got on the table here to do with this game, but also not. Trust me, it'll be good. And we're going to talk about Jonathan Drouin, obviously, missing a mandatory meeting and then being benched the entire game. Thoughts about that? We'll open it up to the chat as well. I'm joined by Sulemaan Ahmed today. It's going to be a fantastic show. If you don't know about him, I will tell you about him after we bring you in. But before we do that, it's March Mania at Sports Interaction. NHL, NBA, March Madness, and so much more. It's bananas. Play Pinata Picks and Minute Madness exclusive games with insane odds you can't play anywhere else. Make your next bet with Sports Interaction. Download the app in Ontario using the QR code you see at the bottom of the screen, or head to sportsinteraction.com/SDPN to get started. 19 plus, please play responsibly. All right, let's welcome in our guest now. Sulemaan, how are you?
Hey, Andrew, thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. For those who don't know, and if you remember last season, one of our favorite guests that we had on was Shireen. This is Shireen's brother. And if you don't know much about Sulemaan, if you remember the whole Conquer COVID-19 thing that was going on, that started with Sulemaan and his family, and he's a huge Habs fan. Let's tell everyone, let's get started this way, Sulemaan. How did you and Shireen become Habs fans not growing up in Quebec?
So we grew up in the East Coast, Nova Scotia and Halifax, and it was actually my mom. So when mom came to Canada in 72, she had never really seen ice hockey. And so that was in the early 70s, mid 70s with the heydays of the Flying Frenchmen. So Guy Lafleur, Jacques Lamel, Steve Shutt, Cournoyer, Robinson, Savard, Lapointe, Dryden, Larocque. So all of those players, Gainey, she followed the team and became a very big Habs fan, which is kind of funny when you see this little Pakistani woman who's watching the Montreal Canadiens and screaming in Urdu at the television when the Habs are losing. And I don't know if one story that's in her family was there was like, if you've ever, I don't know, Andrew, if you've ever been to like an Indian wedding at all.
One, yeah, it was awesome.
So it's big, right? Like it's big. It's just like massive. They do orchestrated dance scenes, Bollywood. So what happens is the girl side and the guy side typically practice or rehearse the dance routines. It's like a dance-off thing, right? So people come to our house, big screen TV, everyone's set to practice a routine. Mom walks in with their food, sits down, changes the channel. Hockey night in Canada, Montreal, and the Bruins were in the playoffs. End of the dance party.
Everyone's around. That's fantastic.
You know,
yeah, I've
in saris and things all ready to go, and I was like, "F that!" Like I'm watching. It's Montreal and Boston, and so they had to like get a boombox or something to practice until the intermission. After coach's corner, then they were allowed to briefly, and then the game started, and Mom was sitting down again. So it started with her. She got us into hockey. And watching hockey, and she's a big fan. And we were lucky a couple of years ago. We actually got to take her to Montreal to see her first game. She got to meet her idol, Guy Lafleur, so it was awesome.
Yeah, it's always cool to hear stories from people who like grew up not necessarily around the game or not necessarily around the team, right? And like found their way there. Like for me, I grew up in Saskatchewan and Alberta. So my story was different than somebody like born and bred in Montreal, right? Like my great grandmother who lived in just a small farming community in Saskatchewan, she was a Habs fan. So when she grew up, like it was without electricity. That's how old she was. She passed away a few years ago now. She was 104.
Nice.
And amazing life. Always fun to hear her stories and stuff like that. But for her, it was like listening to the radio.
Foster Hewitt.
Yeah, before even like back, like I don't even know who the broadcaster would be, but growing up when the Canadiens were young, a young Spitfire team, right? It's not the legendary Cup chasing teams of the 70s or even today where they're trying to recapture that glory. It's the infancy of the organization. It's fun to hear how people come to it. To me, anyway. I don't know if everybody agrees, but I do. All right, let's get this one out of the way, Sulemaan, because I feel like people want to hear about it. The whole Jonathan Drouin thing. There's argument here in the comments about whether he missed the meeting or if he was late to a meeting. I think it was just late, but it was a mandatory meeting. Martin St. Louis said this is something that he couldn't compromise on. It's mandatory. And he was initially going to be scratched, but because Caden Gooley couldn't go tonight, injured in the last game against Florida, Drouin was in the lineup but sat on the bench the entire time. I actually think the best take I've seen from this is actually from Eric Engels from Sportsnet. He's currently not at the game. He's celebrating his 40th birthday back home in Montreal, but he says two things. One, people are late to meetings sometimes, and it's almost always accidental. Don't think there's anything more to it than that. But it's, number two, non-negotiable for Martin St. Louis, and he has to enforce his policy. Somewhat ironic that it happened with Drouin in Tampa of all places. But again, things like this happen every season and are typically dealt with accordingly, and it's no more than that. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Eric. I like, but I like the fact that I don't think he was trying to humiliate Drouin. I think he would have just sat him out if Gooley could dress. But Montreal are the walking wounded. They've got what? How many 7 regular forwards and how many defense are out? And then people worried Anderson was going to be injured tonight. So I think that he had to send a message. It doesn't matter if you're a rookie with a young team or a veteran player. And I think he that sends a message to everyone, because if he makes an exception for Drouin, then if a rookie walks in or Gooley or somewhere Slavkovsky next year turns around and is late, what's he going to do?
Yeah, Renaud Lavoie just reported that Drouin didn't hear his alarm clock and was 2 minutes late to the meeting. I mean, that sucks, but mandatory is mandatory. That makes sense that that's what it was, right? Like sometimes mistakes happen.
Mistakes happens, but there's an expression to coach, like for my son's team, when we coach, we tell them, if you're early, you're on time, you're late. If you're late, you're running.
Yep. And like the way I was always raised was, if you're not 10 or 15 minutes early, you're late. So, I mean, being late is a huge pet peeve of mine. Like if I'm late, I feel awful. Like I had a meeting earlier in this summer and I got in a car accident in the morning and I was going to be late. And I was like, I still felt terrible that I was going to be late. You know, like no matter what the circumstances are, like it sucks that only 2 minutes. That sucks, but he'll be fine. This makes sense to me.
You think any other of the players are going to be late in the future? Now,
probably not.
Guys homecoming back to, or of sorts, back to Tampa Bay, team that drafted him, and he sat on the bench the entire game. No one else going to be like 2 minutes.
Yeah. And Big Bill in the comments says Lavoie also said Drouin accepted Martin St. Louis' decision. Yeah, I don't
have a choice though, Andrew.
No, of course not. But I feel like it's one of those situations where there are certain people who want to read drama into it, and I don't think this is a very dramatic situation. I think this is a very normal thing that happens once in a while. Unfortunate that it happened to Drouin in Tampa Bay, but I think there's also the circumstance that this is a team that's rebuilding, that's not very good. They've had a few days down in Florida. They're probably getting up to some shenanigans down there, you know, in the warm weather, staying out late, overslept his alarm. It happens.
I agree with that. I don't think it's anything more than that, but it's the message has been given, it's received. Like he's not going to tolerate that. So that's
100%. Yeah, Paul in the chat is saying media's already piling on Drouin. Yeah, that happens. There's a certain corner of media that will pile on Drouin no matter what. But I think the takeaway for Drouin right now is that since January, he's actually the Canadiens' top point producer.
Yeah.
So he's doing the right thing. He's working hard. He made one mistake here. He got an appropriate punishment. And tomorrow it's all good again.
Yeah, but it'll be on the front page of Journal de Montréal tomorrow in big bold letters, right?
I'm sure it will, unfortunately. All right. One thing that I wanted to talk about tonight, with Gurianov scoring, with Ylonen scoring, with Hoffman scoring, one thing that's been consistent about this team this year for me is Martin St. Louis being patient with players and putting them in situations to succeed. and finding ways to get them going a little bit. And, Hoffman took a long time to get going earlier on this season. There were times where he looked terrible, but has since, I don't know if he's necessarily elevated his production that much, but his two-way play has come a long way. Gurianov, his goal was great. He's a shoot machine. But what stuck out to me about that is the same kind of thing as with Hoffman, where like Hoffman has diversified his game a little bit to where he's no longer a huge defensive liability, at least at even strength. The Josh Anderson pass to Denis Gurianov on that goal is something Josh Anderson wouldn't even attempt over the last couple of years because he wouldn't shoulder check. He wouldn't find his teammate there. So that little deceptive pass back against the flow of play to Gurianov, it doesn't seem like much, but to a guy who isn't a good playmaker, who doesn't pass very well, who doesn't use his teammates very well, that kind of thing for Josh Anderson, to me, I'm looking at Martin St. Louis and I'm looking at Adam Nicholas and I'm thinking this is a huge progress point for this organization. Because if you can get a guy who's very, very much like they call him the power horse, Josh Anderson, he plays like a horse with the blinders on, right? If you can get him to bite on diversifying his game and expanding his skill set, you can do that for every prospect, for every young player that comes through, and it just elevates the organization piece by piece.
I think Martin St. Louis has got him believing, no, you actually can be a playmaker. You're not just a power forward. You actually do have that in you. And I think if the coach or the management gives the players that belief, doesn't matter whether it's youth hockey or in the National Hockey League, if you tell a player with conviction, I think, that you believe in them, then they start to believe in themselves.
Yeah, it is true, right? And if you can get somebody to change a career-long habit, right? Josh Anderson, I believe, is 28 years old. So he's pretty set in his ways right now. He is pretty much what he is. But at the same time, the Canadiens have found ways to get him to play better this year in a way that wasn't present the previous couple of years. Now, whether that's because he had struggled with injuries or whatever, I see so much more versatility to his game now. And that's, it's not just the young kids that we're seeing this with, it's veterans. And I think that ability from this coaching staff and this development staff to get veterans to play differently, to change their habits in a game as fast as hockey is like kind of unheard of in the NHL. It's really rare. We always hear about in Toronto, right? Like the Toronto Maple Leafs fixed like Alex Galchenyuk in the American Hockey League and stuff like that. And I mean, look what's happened since then. Not so much really, but the Canadiens are actually finding ways to do things like that. And it's really impressive in a season where there hasn't been much opportunity to actually get the most out of players because everybody's hurt.
Well, but I think it's also starts from the top. Like my view is attitude reflects leadership. So if you look at what Jeff Gordon has done, he brought in Hughes, who was not your traditional GM 20 years. Like Jeff Merrick, who I was talking to him earlier today from 32 Thoughts, and he made a really good point. Jeff was saying, like, if you look at, it's not the traditional GM, it's not the traditional coach, because the GM was a player agent. The coach coached his kids' minor hockey team. Like he didn't do a stint in junior or college or the AHL. He went straight to the show. And then you've got people like Chantal Macabé, who was in broadcasting, but she's in hockey communications. I think you were telling me earlier today, Adam Nicholas is coming in as skills coach. You've got Marie-Philippe Poulin who's come in. So I think it's can you think differently? Can you think creatively? Can you think outside the box? And I think you're starting to see that seep into the culture of the team, which was run a certain way for so many years under Bergevin, that I think you're starting to see a little bit of a difference. And I think that's, and then I think you start to see improvement. And the other thing I think is that the team's finally saying we're rebuilding. Like we're not a reset. It's this. Now a rebuild may not take 5 years. It could take 2 or 3 years now, but it's still a rebuild and they're clear. So I think the fans are like, okay, you're not confusing us now. At the deadline, you're suddenly dealing up prospects or young players for, something that win the first round, maybe. I think that's where the fans, like, there's a clear transparency, I think, with the organization on what they're doing, what's going on. And then fans, I think, are a bit more understanding, but I think the test will be in Montreal. How's that going to be in year 2 and 3 and 4? Are fans and the media going to be patient?
Yeah, I think one of the subtle things that kind of shows how patient the fans are overall. Is the team's kind of been in a stealth rebuild, not of their own choice, for several years now. I mean, if not for COVID and the All Canadian division in 2021, this team would essentially be on, I believe it's like the fifth straight year that they'd be missing the playoffs. So players like Cole Caulfield were taken in years where they did miss the playoffs, right? So there is a prospect pool on this team that's significantly better and deeper than a team that should essentially be entering the second year of its rebuild, right? So they're kind of on the fast track in that way, and they have all this depth to build on. They just need those big stars, and they need players to kind of hit their stride and break into the NHL around the same time. And really, what's going to happen is guys like Suzuki and Doc and Caulfield are going to be the vets who are showing the young kids around, which is crazy to think of because they're still so young. But that's where this team's going to be in a couple of years. It's going to be really fun to watch. We got a comment from Sebastian Jackson, who's a scout, who's fantastic. And if you have a spare moment, wish Sebastian some luck, everyone, because he's going through some tough situations with his daughter right now, Sophia, who's fantastic, great family, but struggling with some seizure related issues that have been tough. And she had a seizure actually from the board ads earlier this season that Gary Bettman claims everybody loves. Obviously, not so great for a lot of people. But Sebastian says getting stuff out of players who wouldn't even get claimed off of waivers to start this year, like Belzile and Anthony Richard, is a great sign of good coaching and the players' comfort with Martin St. Louis.
Well, Sebastian, I hope your daughter's okay, and that's a great point. I think that's a sign of a good coaching staff, though. It's not just St. Louis, but it's his assistants that are with him, and it's also what they're doing in Laval. And I think that's something that's like, it also, I think, gives a chance. Like, on one hand, the injuries are bad, obviously, but now you're getting a look at guys like you were telling me earlier, like Harvey Pinard. Did anyone think about him before the year started? Did his name ever come up?
Maybe a little bit, but not to this extent.
Not know where he's a regular. Like, he's got a shot to the team next year, right? Doesn't he?
I would say he's almost, if he's not written in pen, he's in a very hard to erase pencil.
Yeah. Right.
Like
so that gives players a chance, I think, Andrew. Like, that gives guys a chance that will take a look at you. You could be in the show, right? So I think that motivates people, that everyone's got a shot, and a veteran, even a veteran like Belzile has got a shot, right?
100%. I mean, Belzile, he's worked so hard. He actually made his first major mistake, I think, of the season tonight. He made a pretty terrible giveaway in the third period to Tampa, but for the most part, the marquee thing for him is he's an extremely hard worker and very clinical in the way that he handles the puck. So he doesn't make many mistakes. He's not like a high-end offensive guy, despite the fact that his offensive production so far this season has been really spectacular for a fourth liner. I think his on-ice shooting percentage is double league average, so can't really expect that to continue, but he's just put in everything, and he's a guy that, again, some kid is going to have to fight real hard to keep him off the roster next year if the Canadiens bring him back, which I assume that they will. Another comment here from the chat from Paul Aroldi says, I really wish the Canadiens would add more diversity of thought to their coaching, to their scouting staff. Chris Boucher's voice is all alone. This is something I've thought about a lot because Martin Lapointe is very much a guy who likes his big, tough guys, and there's definitely a feeling out there that Nick Bobrov, who is co-head of scouting with Lapointe, is about the same. He seems to like guys who are bigger as well. But I think what we're missing with that is we don't actually hear from most of the scouts involved with the team, right? We hear from the guys at the top, but there can still be diversity of thought that we don't hear. So I do think they need to add, but I'm not sure if we know that they don't have diversity of thought at this point already.
Well, but look at someone like Lane Houston, though. They drafted him. He's not a big player. I mean, he's 5'8" or something, and he's 143 pounds. So I don't I mean, he's obviously one player that was drafted, but Hopefully they do have that diversity, but I'd like to think with the changes in the organization that's reflected in the scouting staff. So maybe it's just not something we hear about, like you said, right? But he raises a really good point.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I know Kent Hughes talked when he first took over that there was going to be changes in the organization, but like not everything can be done overnight. And I think in some ways, unfortunately, I think that the scouting staff is an area that's a bit more of a slow burn because they can't necessarily just fire guys midseason or hire guys midseason. There's a somewhat limited pool there of guys that you know and trust, because that's the biggest thing about scouting is you are relying on somebody to tell you who you should draft, right? A general manager can't go out there and watch every single game from every single player available. It's just not tenable. So you have to trust that person completely with the information that they're giving you. You have to lean on analytics as well. There's a lot that goes into it. And then you've got the whole development stage that is a wholly different thing, right? And the draft is a crapshoot to begin with, but then there's the whole different part. Like the Canadiens for so long have been, figure it out, kid, find your own way in, and if you don't, it's your fault. As opposed to, hey, we spent draft capital on this player. Why don't we move heaven and earth to get the most possible out of this asset, out of this person? Now they're more shifting towards that latter point, right? So it's like they may take bigger players at certain points that maybe aren't the most skilled player available, but will their development staff that they have in place now get more bang for their buck out of that than the previous would have? So it like kind of makes up the gap. It's hard to know at this stage.
I think since the early 90s, the issue for the Canadiens, in my humble opinion, wasn't the drafting. It was their player development was terrible. Their pro scouting was strong, and their player development of amateur youth players from major junior wasn't good. So it's good to see them invest in that area, and I think it's been underserviced for a long time. I think at one point, like Quebec had two scouts, like Quebec.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty wild. They do need to pay a little bit more attention to what goes on at home, but I think that Quebec hockey in general needs to be invested in from the ground up. Like there's a reason why there's very few Quebec-born players nowadays compared to like the 90s, right? Like it's crazy. Like a Quebec-born star barely exists now. Like a lot of the guys who are left in the league are in their mid to late 30s. It's unfortunate. One thing that you brought up, Lane Hutson, I should say, Lane Hutson tonight scored the game-winning goal for BU, which he does it all the time. No one should be surprised. This kid, I can't stop hyping him up because, like, you and I talked around in the first intermission, Sulemaan, about like the pieces that you need going forward and like what the Canadiens could be. Lane Hutson is such a key piece to me because he is your future transition and offensive wizard from the back end. And this kid has outproduced guys like Cale Makar, Quinn Hughes, Adam Fox in his first year of college. He actually put up almost as many points as Makar and Hughes combined in their freshman years. And the types of plays that he's making are ridiculous. Like if you get a chance to see some of the stuff that he's pulled off this year, I highly suggest checking out the highlight reels because he's got shimmy shakes that you don't see very often in players, especially defensemen. He's so smart with and without the puck. And how many overtime, does anybody know how many overtime goals he has this year? Because it seems like every time I know that there's a BU game on, if it goes to overtime, Lane Hutson scores the winner. So if anybody has that, please post it in the chat because he looks like one of those guys that if the Canadiens actually develop him properly, he's not just a boom or bust. He's like elite superstar or bust. That's like the two options with him.
I hope they take their time with him though, because one of the things, like, and I'm dating myself, but if you look at the Canadiens, even since the 50s, they always had like a Norris Trophy guy on the blue line, and they had someone solid on the bench. So more recently, like in the 80s and 90s, they had Jacques Laperrière, who won the Norris for years on the blue line for the Canadiens, right? And then you had, Serge Savard is the GM, but you had solid guys. Then Stu Cowan's written about it. Like Larry Robinson wanted to come back. The club never put him on the bench, right? I just hope that we have the right coaching for. I think Struble got signed. We got some pretty good defensive prospects on the back end, but they typically need longer. Like a buddy of mine plays in the NHL and in his defense, and like they take longer to develop in that way, in that area. So I hope that he's got, like, I hope we don't rush him. Like I think you were saying, like, let him play another year. Let him play, like, as long as it doesn't burn up his, eligibility from an asset management perspective. Give him time to play and develop, and then bring him in. Like, we don't need him next year, I don't think.
No, I mean, if anything, it might hurt their chances of getting another top end pick. Like, unless they get Connor Bedard this year,
I think they will.
they're very much in a similar situation heading into next year as they are in this year, and it'll probably be more difficult to be as far down the standings as they are just because of the fight the team has, and there's no way they could be this unhealthy for a third year in a row, right? There's no way. Maybe Nick Suzuki will finally miss a game. Knock on wood. We don't actually want that to happen. The little kid's an Iron Man. But it is wild. I think Hutson, especially with his size, you want him to play not just next year, but maybe a third year in college. Get that time to build that muscle. Take your time with it. Get used to playing tough games. Get used to being the guy, right? Because it's one thing to dominate as a freshman and surprise everyone. Next year, everybody and their dog is going to be targeting Lane Hutson as a guy to shut down. So it's a big difference, I think, next year to see how he does.
Players are bigger. The players are bigger. They're faster. You're also, the other issue is that there's a grind with the National Hockey League schedule. Like, how are you going to handle early February? Like, how, like you're flying from Winnipeg to, like you're going to St. Louis, right? It's a grind. It's not like college hockey where they get a lot of days off. They practice a lot. Like, it's different, right? It takes time, but I think as long as it doesn't burn them from an asset management perspective, or as years like on his contract because they have to manage that, then let him play there.
Yeah, 100%. One other guy that I wanted to talk about tonight was Jesse Ylönen, who scored again. He's been red hot lately, and is another one of those guys who he played really well last year when he got called up. He didn't really produce too much, and he took a while to start producing in Montreal this year as well. He went like, geez, it seemed like it was like 20 games before he started scoring. It might have been even more, but well, no, he's only played 28 games, so it couldn't have been 20 games. But he's up to 5 goals, on the year now, putting big shots on net. I think that's the biggest thing for him is earlier in the season when he was up, like everyone knows that he has an absolute hammer of a one-timer, but he wasn't getting those opportunities. He wasn't finding space for himself to receive those kinds of passes, or teammates weren't finding him. He's up now playing with guys like Nick Suzuki, playing with Raphael Harvey-Pinard, who he played with in Laval. And the shot that he took tonight was patented Ylönen if you watch Laval. And he's getting those shots now. He's scoring on those shots now. I think that, like, there's conversations around guys like Ylönen, Harvey-Pinard about whether they're going to be part of the actual team that becomes competitive a few years from now, because he's 23, right? Which is a little bit old to graduate from the American Hockey League. Harvey-Pinard's 24. But I look at those guys and I say, it's not about whether or not they're going to be part of that as like a top line scorer or anything like that. It's if you have those guys who can contribute consistently, but maybe not in a top 2 line role, that's just gravy. Like, either you move them later for players that you need to fill, like there's always gaps in your roster you need to fill, especially in the salary cap era, or maybe Ylönen and Harvey-Pinard end up being the 2 wings on a third line, and you get like a killer third line center at some point, which, that might be Kirby Dach if the Canadiens get a player like Fantilli or Bedard in this draft. That's a pretty damn good third line, especially for a team that's not in playoff contention yet.
like any team that's won the cup, you've got 4 solid lines. You're rolling them. So I think from a depth perspective, and if they know how to play Martin St. Louis hockey and they're bought into it, then why would you deal them, right? I sometimes, like, maybe it takes a little bit longer, but remember, like, David Desharnais back in the day, he's in the AHL for a while. He was a pretty serviceable centerman. I mean, I don't know, like, ultimately he was on the top line with Pacioretty, but still he still performed well. So if these guys are a little bit older and they want to be in Montreal, who cares? Like, I don't know if there needs to be that they have to be 21 in order at that point. Maybe his development curve's a little bit different. That's all.
100%. And I feel like Desharnais is a prime example of a guy who, because the Canadiens didn't really have much at center, he was elevated to a role that he wasn't necessarily suited for. And even though he played with an elite winger in Pacioretty who, like, pulled things forward analytically, especially when Brendan Gallagher was on that line as well, people could see he was the weak cog on that line, and he got tremendous amounts of hate for it.
Yeah.
Myself included. As a young guy covering the team, I was way too harsh on David Desharnais. But now, looking back on it, you think, well, this guy was just a really good player who was put in a position he shouldn't have been in, continued to perform, never really complained. And why would anybody hate that guy? Like, it doesn't make sense, but that's just the way, I think, especially as a young person, you kind of watch that when you're frustrated about the direction of the team and you want them to be better. Sometimes you end up putting it on the players who are put in the wrong roles instead of the management team and coaching staff that can't figure it out.
Well, I think they're also building up their depth overall everywhere. I mean, the one area I would say, when speaking to people before the show, I mean, was goaltending is probably the one big question mark. Like, besides that, we have, the argument could be made that Montembeault is a number 3. He's not a 1 or 2. And then do they have really anyone who's in nets? That's in the pipeline, really, that's doing well. So that's one area. Defense takes longer to develop players, as we know, and then but they've got, like, what was it? How many players did they have? Prospects were at the World Juniors this past year.
It was a fair amount. There was Hutson, Meshar, Joshua Waugh. Owen Beck got called up to Canada after an injury. There was more too. Vin says Rohrer was there, but he was injured. Who else was it? They had Adam Engstrom, I think, for Sweden, and Oliver Kapanen for Finland. Like, there was a fair amount of guys there, to say the least.
Well, the last time I remember that they had that many players at the World Juniors was, like, prior to around the 1984 year, and that's when they had that heavy draft when they had Svoboda, Richer, Corson, Waugh, and a whole bunch of other players. The year before, they had guys like Memesso and Claude Lemieux. So they seem to be really packing up the cupboard, so to speak, where I think they've been bare for many years.
100%. And I should say, be careful not to discount Sam Montembeault on this show. The chat is very pro Montembeault.
I know I'm going to get ripped. Like, like tonight he had 40 shots. So I just don't know if he's a number 1. I'm not how he played, but hey, I hope I'm proven wrong, and I hope everyone in the chat rips me up and says, "No, he's our starter next year, you prick." Like, there you go, right? So I don't mind being proven wrong, and I don't mean to offend the Montembeault contingent.
No, I think he's had a fantastic year overall. It might not show in, like, the overall numbers, but when you look at the advanced metrics and, like, goals saved above expected, I believe he's like 7th or 8th in the league, which is crazy. And
advantage of his chance right now. There's no question. Like, he played well tonight. Like, he
did. He made some spectacular saves, and he's kind of been the guy who's ruined the tank a lot of the season, which, there's some people who are probably pretty frustrated at him, but overall, I'm happy for him because he put up with a terrible situation last year and then played through an injury to save Caden Primo's confidence, essentially, down the stretch last year. So I'm a fan of Sam Montembeault, the person, and I'm happy that he's having a good season this year. There's a couple "how dare yous" in the chat.
Sorry, guys. Okay.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
I can't retract that statement now. So
no, it's too late. There was a question. Big Bill says, in order to have all these young players on the roster, who are the veterans that can be moved next year? That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I can tell you a list of the players who eventually need to be moved. I think going into next year, I don't know about you, how familiar you are with like the contract lengths and all that, Suleman, but I know Hoffman has an expiring deal at the end of next season, so I think he's somebody who can be moved just based on how his overall play has improved under St. Louis.
Hard too, I think, right? For Edmonston.
Yeah, yeah. Edmondson has an expiring contract after next year. I think he'll be dealt in the summer. Savard has another year on,
Yeah.
as does Christian Dvorak and Yoel Armia.
Yeah.
Those are the two that I think are going to be the toughest to move. Although apparently the Canadians got calls on Christian Dvorak this year. I was kind of shocked when I heard that because this is the second straight year where I think he's kind of just been terrible.
Well, I think we're measuring him off of what we traded for him too. When you're dealing a first round
True.
per player, right? Like that's, and that was interesting too. When you look at Ken Hughes, like since he's been here, let me ask you this question: how many first round draft picks did Marc Bergevin acquire during his tenure of the Montreal Canadiens? You know, do you or any,
Acquire.
you know how many people know the answer to that question?
I think it's zero.
One.
One? Was
Kotkaniemi.
it to trade up?
No, it was Kotkaniemi, which is when they signed him, and the Habs couldn't do it. They had to get him as a compensation.
Oh, right.
So my next question to everyone in the chat is, how many first round picks did Ken Hughes acquire in his tenure so far as general manager?
Jeez, he got one for Toffoli, one for Monahan, one for Sherratt. So that's three already. I feel like there's another one in there somewhere too.
Well, one for Toffoli, one for Sherratt, Romanov, which he flipped for Doc, right?
Right.
And then one for Monahan, where they also got Monahan. They got the first to take Monahan. So technically, that's four.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, right? So from an asset management perspective, I think he's there, but I believe that you need to also have some solid veterans in the lineup.
Yep.
Because look at Edmonton, like they had top number one overall picks for years, and it didn't go anywhere, right? So I think you need to have the right mix of players, but I think you do have to. I agree with the question, like you do have to make room for these young guys eventually, right?
100%. And that, I think, begs the question of, is it more important for some of these veterans to move them quickly to get some of these younger players reps than it is to get value for them back in trades? I know Kent Hughes so far has been very methodical in his asks don't change. He makes big asks for players and he just waits for people to buckle under the pressure and then gets exactly what he wants. That happened, I think, this year at the deadline where he heard offers for Edmondson and didn't really like the returns. So he's just going to keep Edmondson. He's not on an expiring contract. He doesn't lose anything by keeping him. He just gets to keep him a little bit longer, and the kids love him, so who cares? But it does make sense to eventually, you got to make a decision to move some of these guys out. I know Big Bill, again, adds to his question. He says the biggest elephant in the room is Brendan Gallagher. And last year around this time, I was big on the opinion that like Brendan Gallagher has such a long history of elite level 5-on-5 play, 5-on-5 scoring, that after last year with all those injuries, I thought it was just not fair and kind of ludicrous to think of like moving him in the summer, right? At his worst possible value, all that. It just seemed like a terrible idea to me. However, Brendan Gallagher this year, outside of a few short stretches, has not been back. And he again has suffered injury after injury after injury. He's got lots of years left at a pretty rich contract.
Yeah.
I don't even know what they can do, honestly.
I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe you trade him to Phoenix, just to the Coyotes like everyone else, right? Because obviously we need a National Hockey League team there as opposed to a place like Quebec City. But that's a different conversation. Personally, I don't know if you're going to get a team that's going to grab him for the length and the duration of the contract, but I do think the kids, from what I hear, the younger players love him. He's a leader. I mean, part of the reason he's injured is he plays like a human pinball all the time, right? So he's fearless. I think you want that kind of a player in the locker room and on the ice where he's banged up, but it's going to become a cap management issue too eventually. Like he's still got like how much term does he have left? And he's like something at like 5 or 5.5 or 6 a year on his contract.
After this season, he has 4 more years at 6.5, which would bring him to, I think, 34 years old, which is not the worst contract in the league. And I think the thing for Gallagher is to be worth $6.5 million a year with the way that he plays, it doesn't really take that much. If you like, he doesn't need to be the 30 goal Brendan Gallagher that we saw with like the Tatar Danault line where he was like the scorer on that line, right? He doesn't need to be that necessarily. If he can chip in like 15 to 20 goals, be relatively healthy, and play that hard-nosed game, draw some penalties, he's probably still close to worth that, maybe worth more like 4.5, but in an ideal world, you pay him 4.5, but that's not what we have. We're still dealing with Bergevin's contract shenanigans.
Well,
So
we get Connor Bedard, maybe then we have him on his wing and he's riding shotgun for him, and then we go. Like I'm just
there you go.
that the hockey gods smile on us because the form ghost left the building. I still don't think they've come back. So hopefully maybe they'll finally say, okay, it's your turn now, and we get that guy, and let's see.
Yeah, Trizak in the comments says he wants to see Gallagher next season with Doc and Slavkovsky. If you can't make it work with them, it's time to try to move on. I love the idea in theory.
I like that line. I really
but they played Gallagher with Slav a bunch this season, and the two were like opposite chemistry. They could not get it going. I don't know why. Maybe that comes with, Slavkovsky taking a step next year and being more used to North American ice. Maybe he'll work better with Gallagher. But so like this year, it didn't work very well. My thought that I kind of put out there a few times early in the season when Gallagher was playing all right was, why not? I know they're small. All three of them are small, but why not put him with Suzuki and Caulfield? He can be their forechecking guy that gets the puck loose for them. I feel like Raphael Harvey-Pinard is probably better in that spot at this point, but if you want to get value out of Gallagher, you got to put him in a position to score, and I feel like the Canadiens have pretty consistently been putting him on the third line the last couple of years, and without much, like playing mostly with Christian Dvorak, who again has not been great. They don't have any chemistry. You got to give him something to work with, I think.
Well, Dvorak's not like, look, let's be honest. He's based on what I've seen, he's not capably defensively like Matthew Danault was.
No.
Right? Each one of them, that line of Tatar, Danault, and Gallagher, each contributed a unique skill that complemented the others. He's just Dvorak's just not defensively as responsible as Danault was, right? And then Tatar didn't have to be because he had Gallagher going in the corners and stuff, and Danault was responsible defensively, and Tatar was your trigger man, right? So you just, if you can put those pieces together, then maybe that's it. I don't know. I don't know. I think Dvorak was just a bad trade. It was a desperation move. We needed something when we lost Kotkaniemi.
Yeah, that was typical Bergevin, right? Where he's backed into a corner, and instead of waiting a little bit or, circling back to Danault, who he didn't offer a contract the whole latter half of the 2021 season because he was upset that he didn't immediately take his contract. It's wild. I don't know. At the same time, they probably wouldn't have been able to tank with Danault in the lineup. He's pretty damn good, and who knows, he's probably happier in LA anyway, getting to play with Kopitar and those guys, and that team's in like coming out of their rebuild in a really strong way. Ramelli in the chat says re-sign Gurianov. I say hell yeah. I concur and say hell yeah. I think he's already shown what the Canadiens want him to show.
I think there's players that what was the quote that Martin St. Louis said? Like, he's not writing off a player at 21 or even 25 because and if you look at him, people wrote him off, right? He was in the organization. They dismissed him. He went to Tampa Bay and he lit it up, right? So I think he's a player's coach, and I absolutely, I was happy when they made that trade for Gurianov because he's a first round pick, and he still did pretty well a couple of years ago. He had an off year, so I don't know about you, but I have nightmares when we play Tampa because I see Sergachev back there, and it just seems to be this history of us trading good defensemen. We go back to Chris Chelios down, for Denny Savard, and then we look at Scott Gomez for Ryan McDonough, and then we traded Sergachev for Drouin. It's like, oh my God, like it's just painful. And I don't know if you can see that jersey in the back. One of my clients is from Tampa, so I bet him one time when the Habs were playing the Bolts that the Habs would win, and he was like, "No, the Bolts are going to win." And then loser buys dinner, right? And then I said, "Look, if we're really men of conviction, loser wears the winning team's jersey at dinner." And this was a couple of years ago. Habs are on a roll. I'm all cocky because his Price is playing well. They go into Tampa and they just stink out the joint. I get a smiley text from him at the end of the game. I'm like, "You prick." And then I tell him, "Okay, you won the bet. I'll pick up dinner." But I'm like, "I regret to inform you, I'm not a Tampa fan, never been a Tampa fan, and I don't have a jersey. So you're out of luck, but I'll see you for dinner and I'll pick up the tab." And 2 days later, I was traveling. My wife texted me, "There's a FedEx package that's arrived for you." I had to wear that damn Tampa jersey at dinner at a restaurant in Montreal before a game, and all the staff were looking at me. I just hope they didn't spit in my food.
Yeah, this is actually ironic that you bring that up because this is the 8th-year anniversary of I made a bet with Adam Wilde, who's one of the CEOs of this company, that the Canadiens would win the season series with the Maple Leafs, and his punishment, we each had to buy a jersey of the opposing team with certain things on it, but the jersey he had to wear had my name on it, but it was Jerkshire, number 69, and he had to wear it around for the day. So there's a video on my Twitter if you want to go check that out. But we ended up selling that jersey for sure. We ended up selling that jersey for charity, so it was I believe it benefited Easter Seals. So yeah, good bets that end up benefiting people in need. So everybody won in the end with that one. Yeah, with Gurianov, I remember when the trade was made, the big stipulation that people were like, "Oh, this could be bad," was that he has, if you want to qualify him as a restricted free agent, the qualifying offer has to be at least $2.9 million. And everyone's like, "Oh, $2.9 million. Dude's scoring at a 37 goal pace right now. Do I think he'll continue that? No. But if he scores at half that, will I pay him $2.9 million and hope that he improves the rest of his game as well? Yes. Yeah. Without question.
I think it's like the Doc trade. I think whereas Chicago regrets that move, I think Dallas is going to regret moving Gurianov. Unless he was like a cancer in the locker room or something and caused all kinds of problems, or I don't know. To me, I think he's a great pickup, and I don't think he's one of those Bergevin special deals where he trades like a fourth liner for a fourth liner, or or sometimes you're lucky you pick up like a Byron off the waiver wire type of deal. Like I think he's a good player.
Yeah, Bergevin was pretty good at the waiver wire overall. I will give him that.
Yeah, but you don't win a championship team by being a master of the waiver wire, right?
Well, it's one ingredient for sure, but it's not the ingredient to be bragging about. All right. Yeah, Paul says that Dallas had no room for Gurianov, and Dadonov is doing well for them. Yeah, I mean, they're looking to compete, and Gurianov wasn't fitting in this year. Like, the trade made sense from both perspectives. It's just the Canadiens, I think, clearly got the better overall return.
It's a UFA too, right? Like, so then that's the other thing. Whereas Gurianov still has, I think, a year of term, does he not? Or no, you said he's RFA. So
he's an RFA, so the Canadiens can qualify him and keep him at least another year. Trinka83 says, "I saw in an interview with Martin St. Louis where he said that the best players get multiple chances. Players with something to prove get one. He likes to give players more than one chance no matter how they play." Oh, I absolutely love that.
That's a great quote.
It is a fantastic quote. And obviously something that makes complete sense for Martin St. Louis' career. Yeah. Right? This is why, like, just listening to what he has to say, he's probably the most interesting coach for post-game interviews that I've ever encountered. Like, he always has some little quotable thing in there that makes you think about the game a little bit differently or something, but like the presence he must have walking into the room, like, how can you question Martin St. Louis if he says, like, you need to work harder? You just can't.
No one can say anything to him. He's won it, right? And he's gone the hard route. And I actually think it's going to help the Canadiens because I think, in some ways you're like, well, do I want to go to this city because of taxation or the weather or these other factors, right? But I think the other factor is people are going to be like, I want to go play for him. Like, he's going to make me a better player, or I'm not doing well here. Like, I don't like my coach. Whereas this guy's got just a fresh or different approach on doing things. Like, sometimes you watch teams, any pro team, you look at them and you can see they're loose, even when they're losing, but they're loose. Their body language, the way they're talking, the way they interview with the media, the way they engage with fans. Like, even like they showed it on Hockey Night in Canada tonight. Some lady went up to him during the game and tried to get a selfie with him. And he's like, I'm coaching, right? But he didn't, he wasn't like, he wasn't rude. He was just like, no, right? But home and tried. Maybe she was wearing a Habs jersey. She was wearing a Lightning jersey. So maybe that was it. But still, like, I just think that it's really loose, and that allows the players under the pressure to perform. And, and that's something that, like, I learned in this book by Dr. Amber Selkig, who's a sports psychologist. She worked with the University of Notre Dame and NFL teams. And, she's got a great TED Talk if anyone wants to watch it, just on psychology and how people think. And I think that's a factor too, because they can have the technical skills, the physical skills, but if they're mentally not there, it doesn't matter.
Yep.
Look at Drouin. Look at Stéphane Richer. Like, these guys could put the puck in the net. I'm dating myself now. I'm going really old school. Some people are probably Googling right now. I'm like, who's he talking about? But I think that's the dimension he brings in. And I think free agents and I think other players where maybe they may have no trade clauses or no trade movements, may say, oh, you know what? Actually, I'm going to reconsider Montreal because he's there.
Yep. Big Bill says there are reports already of other players calling Habs players, asking them about how it is to play for Martin St. Louis. Montreal's becoming a destination again. I think it might not be right now still because everyone knows they're rebuilding. But in a couple of years from now, I would not be surprised to see like some large free agency moves from the Montreal Canadiens that people wouldn't normally expect because this team has had trouble selling the market to players. But what you touched on, Sulemaan, I think is really important. And this will be the last thing we talk about, and then we'll wrap the show up. So everybody, please like the stream if you're enjoying the show. It helps the show grow. But you mentioned Martin St. Louis being like a presence that helps the players feel loose.
Yeah.
I think that's especially important in this market. We talked a lot last year about things that the new management group could bring to help, especially young players, be a little bit more insulated in this market, which can be very harsh, right? Montreal can be a great place to play when you're winning, where everybody's on your side, everybody wants a high five in the street. But when you're losing or you're in a big scoring drought, it can also be a harsh place to play, whether it's fans or media. Things can get a little bit personal. Scott Gomez can attest to it with the whole "Did Scott Gomez score?" Website that was made when he went without a goal for about a year.
Yeah.
Jonathan Drouin can attest to it. But I think outside of management, having a coaching staff that's generally positive and consistently puts every player that they can in positions to succeed and clearly isn't there to run guys down, that is an insulation that, like, if you're getting it from the media, getting it from the fans, the last thing you want to do is go into work and get shit on by your coach, right? Nobody wants to get pulled into the video room by Michel Therrien and told that they don't deserve to be in the league. Yeah. Having people approach things as a coaching staff in a positive manner, I feel like that's just such a breath of fresh air.
Well, and you alluded to it, like Brian Burke. What was his quote? Montreal's a tough town to play because they tell you suck in 2 languages.
Yep.
Right. So, but the fans, I think, in Montreal, we have an expectation. We have an expectation that you leave it all on the ice. Like my favorite player, one of mine anyways, was Brian Skrudland. Couldn't skate very well. This is old school, but he worked, right? Like, that's the thing. You look at guys like Steve Bégin, even more recently, like, he worked, right? Like, that's what we want. I think the fans are willing to be patient if they're working, and he's got them working. Like, I think those players, how many, they missed basically a full lineup tonight. Like, they dressed the guy to sit because they didn't have enough players, right? and they went the distance with like the 2-time defending Stanley Cup champion. Like they wanted to win for San Luis tonight. I'm sure they wanted to win for him tonight. So
with like 11 guys out
guys, like
injured, right?
these are people that aren't even on NHL. You can't find like they're in their lineup, right? So like, I think he's done a really good job. I'll admit, I thought when they hired him, I thought it was a joke. I thought this is just, what do I know about hockey, right? Like the guy has just really done a really good job. I think he's keeping the locker room light. And imagine that's in a tough season when you're like, and you have a potential to win the first overall pick. How are they going to look when they're winning?
Yeah.
Right?
No
like,
kidding.
I think the team's going to be a treat to watch, but we're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to suffer for a while. But I think they got to keep them there. That's the main thing, like keep them there. And the other thing you mentioned actually earlier was about the scouts. I think Gordon and Hughes have enough connections to scouts that I think there's other scouts and other teams, and when their term contracts end, they're going to come to Montreal.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
But it takes time. You can't just get them all right away, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. It's funny. I think there are things about this organization that I think they haven't necessarily followed through on overall so far. Yeah. But I think sometimes we forget how young this management group is, not in terms of like their ages, but how long it's been since they took over, right? It's just been over a year for Kent Hughes being in the organization, but like, I know they made big promises in their first big interview with Kent Hughes about, bringing diverse voices into the organization. And like Chantal is great on the PR side of things. Mary-Philippe Poulin, fantastic, but part-time.
Yeah.
They haven't really made that happen overall to at least the standard that I would like to set for them as hockey's marquee franchise.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they're not going to. I think the pressure still needs to be put on them to continue pushing diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, diversity of background in hockey operations. But you make a great point with contracts. Sometimes the person you want isn't available.
I think with Hughes, it's going to get to a point where other GMs don't want to take calls from him. Like they're going to be like, they're just going to be like, oh man, I'm going to lose, right? Like I'm going to lose. I don't want to take what he's offering. Like when Steve Yzerman called to trade Drouin for Sergachev, like Bergevin should have been like, I'm not picking up the phone because it's Steve Yzerman, right?
Should have.
And I wish him success. Like I hope Drouin does well. Like I wish he'd do well. I think Montreal's desperate for a French superstar. We haven't had one in a long time, but there's a lot of pressure in this marketplace too, right? So, and obviously he's got there's mental health issues and things. So I hope he does well. I think you're right. I hope that other issue that happens just blows over. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. Like I'm fingers crossed that we get some good draft picks and stuff, and they continue to push forward.
Absolutely. And there was a comment there saying, imagine Connor Bedard with Martin St. Louis. Holy, that would be wild. And everyone else saying, that'll break my heart when it doesn't happen. Well, you never know. There's a chance.
Well,
still a chance.
Draft lottery, but even if, let's say, we didn't get Bedard, what I'm reading when I was talking to Bob McKenzie is that and then even someone like Frank Cervelli, the draft's deep. Like even if we don't get one, they're like, even if we got 1 to 9, I think, or 10, like they're all good players, right? So, and if Florida keeps doing crappy, and even better, there's a shot that we've got a couple picks there, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Panthers won again tonight, but hopefully they fall apart here soon.
Yeah,
stupid Panthers ruining that first round pick for the Canadiens. But anyway, that's all we have for you tonight on Game Over Montreal. Thank you so much, Sulemaan, for joining me here, and thanks to everyone for sticking it out on this season where the Canadiens lose most of their games, just like last year. And we appreciate you very much. We can't wait until this team is in not even a contending mode, but just pushing playoffs, and then it'll be real fun. I feel like we're going to have a lot of fun on this show. But before we close things out, Sulemaan, is there anything you want to promote?
No, I want to thank you and STPN for having me on, and my apologies to the Montembeault contingent if I offended it.
All right. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll see you all next week.
Game over! Powered by Sports Interaction, Canada Sportsbook.